In 1992, a forensic toxicology laboratory in London processed a routine tox screen on a 23-year-old woman who had been brought in by a friend the previous morning. The woman remembered having a drink. She remembered sitting down. After that, nothing. Not the hours, not the room, not how she got home. The technician running the screen expected alcohol, maybe a benzodiazepine. What came back on the result was something else entirely. Chloroform, a substance invented in 1831. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The technician set the vial down on the steel tray. He had been doing this work for 11 years. He had seen most things. He picked up the result sheet again and read it a second time, not because he doubted the machine, but because the compound on that page didn't belong in 1992. It belonged in a glass case in a medical history museum, next to illustrations of Victorian operating theatres and leather restraining straps. It belonged in the past. It was not in the past. Between 1980 and 2000, chloroform was detected in the toxicology reports of over 1,200 documented sexual assault and incapacitation cases across Europe and North America, 1,200 cases with a paper trail. Researchers who studied the data noted that documented cases represented a fraction of actual incidents, because chloroform metabolizes out of the bloodstream within hours, and most victims weren't tested in time. The real number was almost certainly larger. How much larger? No one could say with confidence. That uncertainty was its own kind of answer. But here is the detail that stops the mind completely. Not one of those 1,200 cases resulted in a restriction on chloroform at the point of production. Not one triggered an international scheduling review. The substance that showed up in that London tox screen in 1992 could be ordered through industrial chemical catalogues the following morning by anyone with a basic business account. No prescription, no justification, no flag. This was not an oversight. There had been time to act, more than a century of it. Chloroform had been in continuous use, in one form or another, since 1847. 45 years before the first X-ray, 60 years before the first antibiotic. It entered the world as the answer to what was then medicine's most persistent and unresolved cruelty. The screaming operating room, where surgery happened to conscious people held down by force, and where the speed of the surgeon's hands was the only mercy available. Chloroform ended the screaming. In the 1850s, that was not a small thing. That was everything. Queen Victoria inhaled it during childbirth and declared the experience a blessing. British military surgeons carried it into the Crimean War in small brown bottles tucked into their coat pockets. By the 1860s, it was available in pharmacies across Europe without a prescription, mixed into syrups and patent medicines and sold as a cure for toothache, insomnia and crying infants. Millions of people encountered it, not as patients under medical supervision, but in their kitchens, in their nurseries, in the small domestic crises of ordinary Victorian life. The same properties that made it useful in an operating theatre made it useful everywhere else too. That was the problem no one wanted to examine directly. Chloroform didn't care why it was being administered. It rendered a person unconscious in under a minute and left them with no memory of the time under its effect. In 1847, that was a miracle. In a different pair of hands, in any era, it was something else. The first documented criminal use of chloroform occurred in 1856, 9 years after it entered clinical medicine. The courts didn't have a framework for it. The medical establishment didn't publicly address it. The pharmacies kept selling it. And then the decades passed, each one carrying the substance forward, in new forms for new purposes, through new hands, while the core fact about what it could do to a person remained exactly the same. the London technician in 1992 labelled the vial, logged the result, and moved to the next sample. He had a protocol for this: fill out the form, note the compound, forward to the investigating officer. He followed the protocol because that was what the protocol was for. But somewhere between logging the result and reaching for the next sample, he paused. Just for a moment, just long enough. Because the question the result raised was not a chemical question. It wasn't a legal question either, though it would soon become one. The question was older than that. It was the question of how something built to end suffering had spent 160 years doing something else entirely, in plain sight, documented, studied, and repeatedly, systematically, quietly overlooked. How does a substance celebrated by a queen end up in a tox screen in a London assault case in 1992? The answer starts in a laboratory in 1831, with 3 chemists in 3 countries who all made the same discovery at the same time, and none of whom understood what they had just created. In 1831, 3 chemists working in 3 separate countries, with no knowledge of each other's work, synthesized the same compound within months of one another. Samuel Guthrie in upstate New York mixed chlorinated lime with whiskey distillate in his backyard laboratory and produced a sweet-smelling liquid he called chloric ether. Eugène Soubeyrand in Paris ran a similar reaction and noted the result in a paper he almost didn't publish. Justus von Liebig in Gießen, Germany, identified the same compound and moved on. It didn't seem particularly significant to him at the time. None of them named it chloroform. None of them recognized what they had made. The name came later. The use came much later. For 16 years, chloroform sat in the chemical literature, documented, catalogued, and ignored. To understand why its arrival in 1847 felt like a rupture, it helps to understand what surgery was before it. Not in the abstract, specifically. A patient scheduled for a leg amputation in 1840 would be given alcohol beforehand, sometimes laudanum if the surgeon was generous, and then held down on the table by 4 men while the cut was made. The average above-knee amputation took between 90 seconds and 3 minutes in the hands of a skilled surgeon. Speed was the only form of mercy available. Surgeons were evaluated not on their delicacy, but on their velocity. The faster the blade, the less the patient suffered. One London surgeon of the era, Robert Liston, was famous for completing amputations in under 30 seconds. His patients still screamed. They just screamed for less time. The mortality rate from surgical shock alone, the body simply failing from the trauma of conscious cutting, ran as high as 30% for major procedures. Patients sometimes died before the wound was closed, not from the injury, from the experience of being operated on. This was the world James Young Simpson inherited when he took the chair of midwifery at the University of Edinburgh in 1840. He was 30 years old, relentlessly ambitious, and already convinced that the suffering built into his field was not inevitable. Women in labour died from exhaustion and shock with the same regularity as surgical patients. Simpson had been searching for an inhalable anaesthetic since ether was first used successfully in Boston in 1846, but ether was slow to take effect, irritating to the lungs and dangerously flammable. He wanted something faster, something cleaner. On the evening of November 4th, 1847, Simpson invited several colleagues to his house on Queen Street in Edinburgh for what had become a regular ritual, the testing of a new chemical compounds by inhalation. They had tried dozens. Most produced headaches or nausea and nothing useful. That evening, Simpson placed a bottle of chloroform on the dining table alongside tumblers and a bowl of water. His colleagues included 2 physicians and a young junior surgeon named James Petrie, 29 years old, 3 years out of his training, who had joined Simpson's circle 6 months earlier and attended these sessions with the focused attention of someone who understood he was watching history being assembled in real time. Petrie was not the most senior man in the room. He was, by most accounts, not even the most talented. But he kept notes. Every session, every compound, every result, recorded in a small leather notebook he carried in his coat pocket. That habit, instilled by Simpson, would follow Petrie for the next 57 years. On November 4th, the notebook entry is short. The handwriting, normally neat, runs slightly sideways toward the bottom of the page. Simpson poured the chloroform into the tumblers and the men inhaled. Within 2 minutes, the room was transformed. The laughter came first, sudden, disconnected, the kind that has no source. Then a heaviness in the limbs, then nothing. Simpson was found on the floor beneath the table. One colleague was slumped across his chair. Petrie, according to his own account, came back to consciousness with his cheek pressed against the cold floorboards and no memory of lying down. They had been unconscious for several minutes. They felt no pain during it. They remembered nothing of the interval. Simpson understood immediately. Not just what chloroform could do, but what it meant. The end of the screaming theatre, the end of the held-down patient, the end of surgery as an act that required the abandonment of compassion in favour of speed. He published his findings within 2 weeks. The paper moved through the medical community at a velocity unusual for the era. Petrie wrote in his notebook that night, after the experiment, after the colleagues had gone home, after Simpson had already started drafting his publication, "I have seen the future of medicine tonight." He was not being dramatic. By every measure available to a man in 1847, he was simply correct. What Petrie did not write down, because it had not yet registered as significant, was the specific quality of the gap in his memory, not the absence itself. He had expected that once Simpson explained what had happened. It was something subtler. When he tried to reconstruct the last moments before unconsciousness, there was nothing to reconstruct. Not a blur, not a fade, a clean edge, like a page with the bottom half removed. One moment he was at the table, the next, the floor. No transition, no approach, just the cut. He noted the compound's name, its smell, sweet, heavier than ether, and Simpson's preliminary dosing observations. Then he closed the notebook. Within 2 weeks of Simpson's publication, requests for chloroform were arriving at Edinburgh apothecaries from physicians across Britain. Within 2 months, it had crossed the Channel. Within 6, it was in use on 3 continents. The speed of adoption had almost no precedent in medical history, because the problem it solved was so visible, so daily, so undeniable, that no institutional body needed to authorize the enthusiasm. Surgeons simply started using it. Not one of them had run a controlled study. Not one had determined a safe dosing threshold. Simpson's self-experiment at a dinner table was functionally the entirety of the preclinical evidence base. The men in that room on Queen Street had been both the researchers and the subjects, and the results had been, by any definition, promising. Promising. That word would carry a great deal of weight in the years ahead. By January 1848, James Petrie had administered chloroform to 11 patients. All 11 had survived. All 11 had thanked him afterward. He was keeping careful records: the dose, the duration, the patient's weight and age, the recovery time. His notes from this period have a quality of controlled excitement, the handwriting slightly more pressed than usual, as if the pen were moving faster than the thoughts could organize themselves. He had not yet seen what chloroform could do when something went wrong. He was 3 weeks away from finding out. Hannah Greener was 15 years old. She lived in Winlerton, a village in County Durham, England, and on January 28th, 1848, 85 days after Simpson's dinner party experiment, she was brought to a local surgeon for the removal of an infected toenail. not a dangerous procedure, not even a significant one by the standards of the era. The surgeon, a man named Mr. Meggerson, decided to use chloroform because he had recently read Simpson's paper and the case seemed ideal. Minor surgery, nervous young patient, brief procedure. He soaked a cloth with a small amount of chloroform and held it to Hannah's face. Within seconds she went limp. Within 2 minutes she was dead. Meggerson's account, published in The Lancet 3 weeks later, described how Hannah's pulse vanished almost immediately after inhalation, not gradually, not with warning, but between one heartbeat and the next. He had administered what he believed was a conservative dose. He had followed Simpson's published guidance exactly. There was nothing in the literature to tell him that for some patients, under some conditions, the gap between the dose that produced unconsciousness and the dose that stopped the heart was nearly non-existent. That gap, that terrifyingly narrow window, was the central fact about chloroform that the medical world had not yet measured, because no one had tried to measure it systematically before releasing the compound into clinical practice. Hannah Greener's death was the first documented fatality from chloroform anesthesia. It was published. It was read. Simpson himself responded, suggesting Meggerson had administered incorrectly. The debate that followed in the medical journals was detailed, technical, and within 6 months, essentially over. Not because the question was resolved, but because by then chloroform was already everywhere, and the momentum of its adoption had grown too large for a single death in County Durham to redirect. James Petrie read the Meggerson report in his Edinburgh office on a Tuesday morning in February 1848. He set the journal down on his desk and sat with it for a while. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote the date, the patient's name, the circumstances, and the outcome. Hannah Greener, 15, toenail removal, cardiac arrest, 2 minutes post-inhalation. He underlined the 2 minutes. He had no explanation for it. Neither did anyone else. 3 days later, he administered chloroform to his 12th patient, a 40-year-old man requiring a tooth extraction. The man survived without incident. Petrie recorded the dose, the duration, the recovery. His hand was steady. His notes were precise. But on the same page, above his clinical observations, the underlined notation, 2 minutes, sat like a question no one had answered yet. The answer, it turned out, would wait decades. By then, thousands of administrations would have accumulated on top of it. What happened next was not a slowing down. It was an acceleration. Within 18 months of Simpson's publication, chloroform was in clinical use in Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, the United States, Canada, and parts of South America. The speed had no single cause. It was the compound's own properties that drove it. Easier to transport than ether, no flammability risk, faster induction, smaller required dose. For field surgeons, military physicians, and rural practitioners who operated without assistance, chloroform was simply better in almost every practical respect. The one respect in which it was worse, the narrowness of the margin between effective and lethal dose, was invisible until it wasn't. The Crimean War, beginning in 1854, embedded chloroform into military medicine permanently. British Army surgeons operated under conditions that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier, performing amputations, removing shrapnel, closing abdominal wounds, unconscious patients held down by exhausted orderlies. Chloroform changed that. Small bottles, each enough for multiple procedures, distributed through field kits across the peninsula. The screaming stopped. The survival rate from surgical shock dropped. The surgeons wrote home about it. The letters described chloroform the way soldiers describe effective equipment, with a straightforward, grateful practicality. It worked. It was reliable. It was the difference between a man surviving his wound and a man dying from the experience of having it treated. Petrie read those letters. He was not in the Crimea. A knee injury from a riding accident the previous year had ended any possibility of field service, but he corresponded with 2 surgeons who were. Their reports were uniformly positive. No deaths mentioned. Whether this reflected the compound's safety or the chaos of field record-keeping was something Petrie wondered but didn't pursue in writing. Then came 1853, and with it, the moment that made all professional debate essentially futile. On April 7th, 1853, Queen Victoria inhaled chloroform during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold, administered by Dr. John Snow, the same physician who would later map the Broad Street cholera outbreak and transform epidemiology. Snow had developed a specific inhaler device to control the dose, a cloth cone fitted with a measured reservoir, and had been refining his technique for 2 years before the royal administration. He described the Queen afterward as finding the chloroform soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. The Queen's endorsement was published. The Archbishop of Canterbury had previously argued that pain in childbirth was a divine ordinance, and that chemical interference was theologically problematic. After April 7th, that argument collapsed in public discourse within weeks. If the Queen used it, it was safe. If the Queen used it, it was appropriate. The royal body had settled a medical debate that the medical community itself had not resolved. Petrie noted this in his journal without comment. Just the date, the patient, the physician, the outcome, 1 sentence. But the entry immediately following it, dated 4 days later, records a sharp increase in requests for chloroform anaesthesia from patients at his practice who had previously declined. 3 women asked specifically because of what they had read about the Queen. They used that word, safe. Petrie administered the chloroform. All 3 recovered without incident. His records show his dosing measurements becoming more granular around this period. Smaller increments noted, durations tracked to the quarter minute. He was calibrating with increasing precision, though he didn't explain why in his notes. He didn't need to explain it to himself. Hannah Greener's name was still on the page above. The adoption continued. In France, the Académie de Médecine issued a cautious but positive assessment. German hospitals incorporated it into standard surgical preparation. American practitioners, initially more conservative, shifted after their own military surgeons returned from the Mexican-American War with field reports. By 1855, the question in medical circles was no longer whether to use chloroform. It was how much, how often, and administered by whom. That last variable, administered by whom, turned out to matter enormously. Because what Snow had understood, and what his careful dosing apparatus represented, was that chloroform safety was not intrinsic to the compound. It was a function of the person holding it. An experienced anaesthetist using a calibrated device and monitoring the patient's pulse was doing something fundamentally different from a rural surgeon pouring the liquid onto a folded handkerchief and pressing it to a patient's face. But both methods were described in the literature using the same word, chloroform. Both produced unconsciousness. Only one reliably produced survival. The distinction between those 2 methods was not encoded in any regulation. It was not enforced by any body. It existed only in the judgment of the individual physician, and in 1855 the individual physician had, on average, read Simpson's paper and perhaps 1 follow-up report, and that was the entirety of their training. Petrie knew this. He had watched Snow's technique described in detail in the medical press, and had written to Snow directly requesting more information about the cone apparatus. Snow responded within 2 weeks with a detailed letter that Petrie copied, verbatim, into his notebook. He then built his own version of the device, modified slightly for the dimensions of his operating room. He was one of perhaps a dozen practitioners in Britain who had done so by that point. The others were using handkerchiefs. And somewhere outside the hospitals, outside the surgeries, outside the correspondence networks of careful Edinburgh physicians, someone had read enough about chloroform to understand one specific thing about it. The same thing that made it valuable in an operating theatre. It rendered a person unconscious within seconds. It left them with no memory of the time under its effect. That knowledge was now public. It had been published, celebrated, endorsed by royalty, and distributed through pharmacies without restriction. What happened next with that knowledge was not a medical question. But the medical establishment was the only institution that had the authority to address it, and it was looking the other way, absorbed entirely in the expansion of a miracle it had given the world before it fully understood what the world would do with it. To understand what chloroform actually did to the human body, why it worked, why it killed, and why the line between those two outcomes was so difficult to locate, it helps to follow it from the moment it entered the lungs. Chloroform vapour, inhaled through a cloth or cone, crossed from the airways into the bloodstream in under 30 seconds. From there it moved to the brain, where it suppressed the central nervous system in a specific sequence that anesthesiologists would not fully map for another century. First came the excitement stage, a brief window of confusion, sometimes laughter, sometimes agitation, lasting anywhere from seconds to 2 minutes depending on the dose and the patient. Then depression of the higher brain functions, producing the heavy-limbed compliance that surgeons found so useful. Then surgical anaesthesia, the deep, still state in which a man could have his leg removed without flinching. Then, if the dose continued or the patient's physiology was particular in certain ways, cardiac arrest. The heart simply stopped. The distance between the third stage and the fourth was not a cliff. It was a single step. What made chloroform so treacherous was that it sensitized the heart to adrenaline. A patient who became frightened during induction, who struggled, whose pulse spiked, could tip from the second stage directly into cardiac failure without ever reaching surgical anesthesia at all. The excitement stage was therefore not just an inconvenience, it was the most dangerous moment of the entire procedure. And it happened first, before the patient was under, before the surgeon had any indication that something was going wrong. Hannah Greener had almost certainly died in that window. 2 minutes was exactly the duration of the excitement phase. James Petrie understood this by 1853. He had pieced it together not from a single source but from the accumulation of his own records alongside the scattered reports arriving in the medical journals. A death in Lyon, a near miss in Manchester, a cardiac event in Philadelphia that the attending physician had managed to reverse by stopping the administration and positioning the patient upright. The pattern was visible if a person was specifically looking for it. Petrie was looking for it. He was 35 years old that year. His practice occupied 2 rooms on the ground floor of a terraced house in Edinburgh's New Town, a neighbourhood of pale stone Georgian facades and iron railings, where the cobblestones were swept every morning by a boy who started work before the street lamps went out. Petrie walked to his practice from his home 4 streets away, his leather bag in one hand and his notebook already in his coat pocket, arriving before his first patient and leaving after his last. His wife, Catherine, had learned to recognise the particular quality of his silence at dinner on days when a procedure had gone less smoothly than expected. Not a troubled silence, just a measuring one, as if he were still running the afternoon's calculations. She did not ask about it. She refilled his glass and let him work through whatever it was he was working through. By 1853, Petrie had administered chloroform over 200 times. He had not lost a patient. He kept a separate column in his records for what he called irregularities, moments where the patient's breathing changed unexpectedly, where the pulse became difficult to locate, where the recovery time ran longer than the dose should have produced. The irregularities column had 11 entries by April of that year. None had resulted in death. All 11 had at some point required him to stop the administration and intervene. 11 near misses in 200 cases. That was 1 in 18. He had not published this figure. He had not shared it with Simpson. He was not yet sure what it meant, whether his patient population was atypical, whether his dosing was conservative enough to catch problems early, whether another physician seeing the same irregularities would have categorized them differently. He needed more data before he could say anything definitive. That was the scientific position. That was also, it should be noted, a very convenient position for a physician whose practice depended on being seen as competent with the era's most celebrated medical tool. In May 1853, a coal miner named Thomas Adair arrived at Petrie's practice on a Tuesday afternoon, brought by 2 colleagues who had half carried him from the cart outside. Adair was 44 years old, powerfully built, with the kind of hands that showed 20 years of underground work. The knuckles enlarged, the skin permanently darkened along the creases regardless of washing. A collapse at the Gilmerton pit 2 days earlier had crushed his lower left leg. The wound had been dressed at the site, and he had been transported home, where a local apothecary had determined after examining the injury that the leg needed to come off below the knee. Adair had refused to go to the hospital. He had heard what happened in hospitals. Petrie's name had been given to him by a neighbour whose wife had delivered a child under chloroform 18 months earlier and survived without complication. That reference was enough. Petrie examined the leg and confirmed the amputation was necessary. He explained the procedure, explained the chloroform and explained the risks with the directness his patients had come to expect from him. Not frightening detail, but honest probability. Adair listened without expression, and then gave a single nod. The cone was prepared. Petrie's modified version of Snow's apparatus, slightly wider at the base, with a linen lining he changed between each patient, was placed over Adair's nose and mouth. The chloroform was measured into the reservoir, a conservative dose, calculated against Adair's weight. His 2 colleagues were positioned at his shoulders, not to restrain him but to support him if needed. Petrie's assistant monitored the pulse at the wrist. The excitement stage lasted 90 seconds. Adair's hands gripped the arms of the chair twice, then relaxed. By the 2-minute mark, his breathing was slow and regular. His pulse was strong, steady, 56 beats per minute. Petrie made the first incision at 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The amputation took 11 minutes. Adair did not move. His pulse did not waver. When Adair came back to consciousness 40 minutes later, his first action was to look at where his leg had been, not in distress, but with the focused practicality of a man calculating what his life now required. Petrie recorded this detail. He wrote that Adair had reached out and touched the bandaging with one finger, as if verifying a fact he already knew, but needed to confirm physically. Adair was helped back to the cart and taken home. He sent a message to Petrie 3 weeks later, delivered by the same neighbour who had made the referral, reporting that the wound was healing cleanly and that he had felt nothing during the procedure. He used a specific phrase that Petrie copied into his notes verbatim. The man had written that it was as if the surgery had happened to someone else, in another room, while he was somewhere quiet. Petrie read that phrase several times. Somewhere quiet. He wrote it down, and then sat with his notebook open for several minutes without adding anything else. Because that phrase, the surgery happening somewhere else, the self absent from its own body's experience, was also what the patients with longer than expected memory gaps had described. Not just the duration of the surgery, but the period after it. One of Petrie's patients had lost 4 hours he couldn't account for. Another had woken the following morning with no memory of the previous evening's events. Both had received doses within Petrie's standard range. Both had been adults in reasonable health. Adair's case was straightforward. A clean outcome by every recorded measure. But the phrase he sent back lodged in Petrie's mind alongside the 11 irregularities, alongside Hannah Greener's 2 minutes underlined on the page, alongside the question he was still building toward but hadn't yet fully assembled. What was chloroform actually doing to memory? Not during the procedure. That absence was expected and desired. But after it, in the hours that followed, in the period when the patient was apparently awake and functional, and by every observable measure recovered. Petrie's notes from the autumn of 1853 show him beginning to track a new variable, the duration of post-procedural memory loss, distinguished from procedural memory loss. He asked patients, at a follow-up visit, to describe their last clear memory before the chloroform and their first clear memory after recovery. The gap between those 2 points was consistently longer, in some cases significantly longer, than the duration of the procedure itself. He had no framework for what this meant. The neuroscience that would eventually explain it didn't exist yet. He was observing a pattern without the vocabulary to describe it, tracking a phenomenon that the rest of the medical world was not tracking at all, because no one else was asking patients the specific question he was asking. He didn't know yet whether this was a medical curiosity or something more significant. He didn't know yet that the answer to that question would take his own family over a century to find. For now, in the autumn of 1853, James Petrie sat in his practice at the end of each day and wrote his records by the light of a lamp that left a faint oval of warmth on the page. Outside, Edinburgh's new town was quiet at that hour, the cobblestones empty, the boy with the broom long since gone home, the notebooks accumulated on his shelf, 47 years' worth eventually, each one precise, careful, and full of things that no one would read for a very long time. The next entry in his journal, dated November 3rd, 1853, begins with a routine case record. But in the margin, in handwriting slightly smaller than his usual hand, he had written 4 words with no explanation attached to them, no context, no elaboration, as if he was testing the thought before committing to it fully. The 4 words were, longer than the procedure. He underlined them once, then turned the page. In 1854, a paper appeared in the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal that should have changed everything. Its authors had compiled every documented chloroform fatality reported in the British and European medical press since January 1848. The final count was 123 deaths, not estimates, not projections, documented cases, each with a patient description, an administering physician, a dose where recorded, and an outcome. The paper called for 3 specific responses from the medical establishment: a standardized dosing protocol, a mandatory reporting system for adverse events, and a moratorium on administration by untrained practitioners. The language was measured, the evidence was exhaustive, and the conclusion was impossible to dismiss on scientific grounds. The medical establishment dismissed it anyway. Not loudly, quietly. No major journal ran an editorial response. The Royal College of Surgeons did not convene a committee. Simpson, whose name and endorsement had driven chloroform's adoption across 3 continents, published a brief rebuttal in which he attributed the deaths to improper technique rather than the compound itself. His argument was not entirely wrong. Technique did matter, as Petrie's own records confirmed, but it was also precisely the kind of response that absorbed the impact of a damaging finding without requiring any institutional change. The paper's lead author was Dr. Arthur Laycock, 31 years old, a former student of Simpson's own department at Edinburgh. This detail did not appear in any of the subsequent coverage, such as it was. Laycock had trained under the man whose reputation was most directly threatened by the findings, and had published them anyway. That required a specific kind of professional courage, the kind that tends to be rewarded in institutional medicine with silence. Petrie read Laycock's paper on the morning it arrived in his post. He read it twice, then set it on his desk alongside his own records. He opened his notebook to the irregularities column. 11 entries. He turned to his post-procedural memory observations. 6 patients now, tracked across the previous 8 months. He sat with both pages open in front of him for a long time. Then he took a sheet of paper and began writing a letter to the journal. He wrote for an hour. The letter described his irregularities data, his memory gap observations, and his conclusion that Laycock's findings were consistent with patterns visible in a single careful practice, which meant they were almost certainly visible, unrecorded, across the hundreds of practices now using chloroform throughout Britain. He laid out the case precisely. No alarm, no dramatics, just the numbers and what they suggested. He folded the letter, he addressed it. He placed it on the corner of his desk where outgoing correspondence waited to be collected. It was still there 3 days later, still there after a week. Petrie moved it once to make room for a patient file and placed it underneath a medical gazette. When Catherine asked about the stack of papers on his desk, he told her it was correspondence he was still considering. She didn't ask again. The letter was never sent. What stopped him was not fear, exactly. It was something more precise than that. Laycock's paper had already made the argument. The establishment had already responded with silence. A letter from a single Edinburgh practitioner, however well documented, would not shift a position that 123 deaths had failed to shift. And sending it would mark Petrie as an opponent of the consensus that had made his practice viable. The consensus that chloroform used by trained physicians was safe enough to continue using without restriction. He was a trained physician. He'd used it safely over 200 times. The letter would implicate him in the problem it was describing, and he could see no clear path from writing it to any outcome that helped anyone. This was the calculation. It was a rational calculation. It was also the same calculation being made in varying forms by every physician who had noticed something and stayed quiet. Laycock published one follow-up note the following year, updating his death count to 141. It received no response at all. By 1857, his name had largely disappeared from active citation in the anaesthesia literature. He moved to a general practice in Yorkshire and appears to have stopped publishing. What he thought about that trajectory, no record shows. Outside the medical journals, something else was happening. Something the journals were not tracking because no one had yet decided it was medicine's problem. In the autumn of 1856, a Liverpool magistrate's court heard the case of a man named George Burrell, a 38-year-old merchant's clerk charged with robbery and assault. His victim, a widow named Mrs. Frances Doyle, reported that she had admitted Burrell to her home under the impression he was there to discuss a business matter related to her late husband's estate. She remembered offering him tea. She remembered nothing after that until she woke on her kitchen floor, with her bureau broken open and her household savings gone. A physician examined her the following morning and noted a faint, sweet odour on her clothing and an unusual dilation of her pupils inconsistent with simple unconsciousness from a blow. The physician noted chloroform as a possibility in his examination report. He was not called to testify about this specific finding. Burrell was convicted of robbery. He received a sentence of 7 years. The mechanism of the assault, the specific means by which Frances Doyle had been rendered unconscious and robbed of her memory of the event, was not addressed in the verdict. The judge, working within a legal framework that had no category for chemical incapacitation as a distinct offence, treated the case as a straightforward property crime. The chloroform finding sat in the physician's report, which sat in the court file, which sat in the Liverpool Magistrates' Archive. Petrie never knew about Frances Doyle. The Liverpool case was not reported in the Edinburgh papers. But the pattern it represented, the use of chloroform not to heal but to erase, was not isolated to Liverpool, and it was not new even in 1856. There had been at least 3 similar cases in London between 1852 and 1855, identified later by historians reviewing court records. In each one, the chemical mechanism was either not identified by the examining physician or not raised in court. In each one, the victim reported complete memory loss for a period significantly longer than any injury would explain. The same extended memory loss Petrie was documenting in his surgical patients. The same gap he had written about in his notebook margin, longer than the procedure. He had been measuring it in an operating context, tracking it as a clinical curiosity, searching for a neurological explanation. But the same property that created it, chloroform's specific disruption of memory consolidation, extending well beyond the period of unconsciousness, was operating identically in every context where the compound was used. Operating room, kitchen floor, it made no difference to the chemistry. Petrie did not know about the Liverpool case. He did not know about the 3 London cases. He was not connected to the criminal courts and had no mechanism by which that information would reach him. He was working in a medical silo, observing one facet of a phenomenon that was visible from multiple directions simultaneously, while each person observing a different facet had no line of sight to the others. The medical establishment had the authority and the information to connect those directions. Laycock's paper had pointed toward the connection. 123 deaths was evidence of a compound with properties that extended beyond controlled clinical use. The response had been silence and a slow professional erasure of the man who raised it. In Yorkshire, Laycock continued seeing patients. Colds, fractures, difficult childbirths. His copy of his own paper sat on a shelf in his consulting room. Whether he took it down and read it in the evenings, no record says. He died in 1889, his work uncited, his name absent from the histories of anaesthesia that were already being written by then, histories that began with Simpson's dinner party, and moved forward without pausing over the 141 deaths that had accumulated in the first 6 years. And in Edinburgh, in the autumn of 1856, Petrie closed his notebook at the end of a Tuesday and walked home through streets that smelled of coal smoke and rain. His unsent letter was still under the Medical Gazette on his desk. He had stopped thinking about sending it. What he had not stopped thinking about, what would stay with him for the next decade quietly without resolution, was a simpler question than the one in the letter. Not what should the medical establishment do, but what exactly was chloroform doing to memory, and why did the effect persist so far beyond the unconsciousness itself? He didn't have the answer. The science to find it didn't exist yet. But someone else, outside the medical world entirely, had already noticed the same property and had started thinking about what it was useful for. The first pharmacy in Britain to sell chloroform directly to the public without any medical consultation did so in 1861. It was not breaking any law. There was no law to break. The compound moved from the dispensary shelf to the customer's hand across a wooden counter, wrapped in brown paper, for approximately 4p per fluid ounce. The pharmacist's only question, if he asked one at all, was whether the customer wanted it in liquid form or mixed into a preparation. The preparations were where the domestic market truly opened up. Chlorodyne was the most successful of them. Invented by a British Army surgeon named John Collis Brown, who had developed it during the cholera epidemic in India in 1849, it combined chloroform with morphine, cannabis tincture, and prussic acid, what would now be called hydrogen cyanide, in a proprietary formula that its manufacturer J.T. Davenport of London marketed aggressively through newspaper advertisements and pharmacist displays. The advertisements described chlorodyne as a remedy for cholera, diarrhea, coughs, neuralgia, sleeplessness, and what the copy referred to as general nervous excitement. It was available by mail order. It was cheaper than alcohol. A bottle lasted a family several weeks if used sparingly, and the instructions on the label defined sparingly loosely enough to be meaningless. By 1870, chlorodyne was in an estimated 1 in 4 British households. Mothers used it to quiet infants during night crying, a few drops on a cloth held near the face, or diluted in warm water and administered by spoon. The infants slept. They slept very deeply. Most woke up. The ones who didn't were recorded as having succumbed to convulsions or failure to thrive, diagnoses capacious enough to absorb a great deal that went unexamined. There is no count of how many Victorian infant deaths were chloroform deaths. The records don't exist in a form that would allow it. What exists is the sales data, and the sales data shows consistent growth across 4 decades. James Petrie was 62 years old in 1880. He had retired from surgical practice 3 years earlier. The knee that had kept him from the Crimea had worsened progressively, and by 1877 he could no longer stand through a full procedure. He still maintained a small consulting practice, seeing patients in the same 2 ground-floor rooms, but the operating work had passed to a younger partner. He had 41 notebooks by then, stacked on the shelf behind his desk in the order they had been filled, the earliest one's spines faded to a pale tan. He had begun, in his retirement, the project he had always intended and never had time for, reviewing the full run of his records for patterns he might have missed in the daily accumulation. He was looking, specifically, at the memory gap data. 27 years of post-procedural memory observations, tracked with the precision of a man who had always suspected they meant something he couldn't yet articulate. What he found, working through the notebooks methodically across the winter of 1880, was that the extended memory loss was not random. It clustered. Patients who had received chloroform for longer procedures, patients who had been re-administered after waking too early, and, most significantly, patients who had received chloroform during a state of heightened anxiety showed dramatically extended post-procedural memory gaps, not by minutes, by hours. He wrote a summary of these findings on 12 pages, cross-referenced to specific notebook entries, organized, clear, ready to be shaped into a publishable paper. Then he put the 12 pages in the back of notebook 41 and kept consulting. He was 62. Laycock had published, been ignored, and vanished from the literature. Petrie had watched that sequence from close enough range to understand its logic. The 12 pages stayed where they were. Outside his window, Edinburgh was changing. Gas lamps had given way to early electric streetlights on the main thoroughfares. The city smelled different than it had in 1847. Less coal, more industry, a metallic undercurrent that hadn't been there before. And in the newspapers stacked in his waiting room, a new phrase was appearing with increasing frequency: the chloroform epidemic. It referred not to medical overdoses but to crime. Between 1880 and 1900, European newspapers documented over 300 cases of what they called chloroform robberies, incidents in which victims were rendered unconscious by chloroform administered covertly, typically through a cloth pressed to the face from behind, and then robbed, assaulted, or both. London, Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Vienna. The geography was consistent with wherever chloroform was available without restriction, which was everywhere. The newspapers covered these cases with a mixture of alarm and the particular Victorian fascination with criminal ingenuity, stories that emphasized the audacity of the method almost as much as its consequences. The police were less publicly engaged with the subject than the newspapers, which is not the same as saying they were unaware of it. In 1887, The Metropolitan Police in London completed an internal report on chloroform-related crime compiled from case files spanning 1870 to 1886. The report identified 47 confirmed cases in the London area alone, robberies, assaults, and what the report carefully categorised as incidents of an indecent nature, where the victim had no memory of events. It recommended restrictions on retail sale of chloroform and mandatory recording of purchases by pharmacists. The report was circulated within the Metropolitan Police Command and forwarded to the Home Office. No restriction was implemented. No recording requirement was established. The report was filed. In 1893, the Paris Prefecture of Police completed a nearly identical exercise covering the preceding decade. 61 confirmed cases, similar recommendations, same outcome. Neither report was made public. Both were eventually declassified through routine archival processes decades later, the London report surfacing in 1962, the Paris report in 1971, by which point they were historical documents rather than actionable evidence. Researchers who found them noted their existence in footnotes. The footnotes were not widely read. Petrie did not know about the Metropolitan Police report. He found out about the newspaper coverage of chloroform robberies the same way his patients did, by reading the papers in the morning. He clipped several articles and placed them inside Notebook 41, next to the 12-page summary he had written and not published. He added a single line at the top of the clippings, same mechanism, different context. He did not elaborate. He did not need to elaborate for himself. The connection between his memory gap observations and the utility of those gaps to a criminal was not a complex inference. What he didn't do, again for the second time in his career, was publish it. In Brussels, in March 1891, a 27-year-old seamstress named Marguerite Collin left her employer's shop on the Rue de Midi at 7:30 in the evening and did not return home. She was found the following morning by a neighbour in an alley 4 streets from her home, conscious but disoriented, her clothing disordered, her memory containing nothing after the moment she had turned onto a street she did not usually take. A physician was called. He noted the smell on her collar, faint, sweet, unmistakable to anyone who had worked with the compound. He recorded his finding in his examination report. Possible chloroform exposure. Recommended investigation. The police officer assigned to the case interviewed Marguerite Collin twice. His report, submitted 5 days after the incident, concluded insufficient evidence for prosecution. It described the victim as having been in a confused state and noted that no witness had come forward. The physician's toxicology observation was referenced in a single, subordinate clause and characterized as inconclusive. The case was closed. Marguerite Collin's name did not appear in any newspaper. The physician's report was filed with the case documents. The case documents went into the Brussels Police Archive, where they would remain untouched for 110 years, and chloroform kept moving through the century. By 1900, the medical profession had largely recognized, though not yet formally, that chloroform was too unpredictable for routine surgical use. Ether produced a wider margin between anesthetic and lethal dose. Newer compounds were emerging. The slow replacement had begun, not because of the deaths, or the criminal cases or the police reports that had been filed and forgotten, but because of straightforward clinical pragmatism. Other options worked better in the operating room. Removal from medicine, however, did not mean removal from production. Chloroform was by then a significant industrial chemical, a solvent for rubber, fats, and oils, a precursor in the synthesis of other compounds, an ingredient in refrigerants and fire extinguishers. Industrial demand had no connection to medical demand. The factories continued. The price continued to fall. The availability continued to expand. James Petrie died on a Thursday in February 1904, aged 86, in the same house in Edinburgh's new town where he had lived for 50 years. He had continued consulting until the previous autumn. His 47 notebooks were stacked on the shelf in his practice, exactly as they had always been, labelled by year in his own hand, the earliest ones from 1847 still legible despite the fading. His son arranged for the notebooks to be donated to the University of Edinburgh Medical Archive, in accordance with a note Petrie had left with his papers. The note expressed a hope that the records might prove useful to future researchers. The archive accepted the donation, assigned it a catalogue number, MSGen 1847/P, and placed the 47 notebooks in an acid-free box on a shelf in the reading room of the medical faculty building. The box was not opened for 73 years. Outside the archive, in the city Petrie had watched transform across 6 decades, the electric trams ran on their new steel rails, and in the pharmacies along Princes Street the preparations containing chloroform were still available over the counter, their labels describing them as remedies for sleeplessness and nervous tension. The same preparations, the same compound, the same counter. Petrie's 12-page summary was in the back of Notebook 41, in the box on the shelf. The librarian who catalogued the donation wrote a brief description on a card that was filed alphabetically under P, Medical Practice Records, Edinburgh, 1847 to 1903. Personal observations, some of clinical interest. That was all. The card was correct, technically. It was also in its specific choice of the word some, one of the great understatements in the history of a building full of understatements. Somewhere in the floors below the archive shelf, in the teaching rooms of the same medical faculty, a new generation of students was learning anesthesiology from textbooks that began with Simpson's dinner party experiment and moved directly to ether and the newer halogenated compounds, skipping the intervening decades with the efficiency of narratives that have decided what matters and what doesn't. Chloroform appeared in those textbooks in a single paragraph, a historical note, a stepping stone to better things. The 141 deaths Laycock had counted were not mentioned. The police reports were not mentioned. The 12-page summary in Notebook 41 was not mentioned because no one knew it existed. And in the industrial chemistry catalogues distributed to businesses across Europe and North America, chloroform was listed between chlorobenzene and chloroprene, with a purity specification, a price per litre, and a standard industrial order form requiring no more documentation than a company name and a delivery address. The box on the shelf was sealed. The catalogues were open. The century turned and kept turning, and the question Petrie had spent 50 years approaching but never quite reaching sat in an acid-free box in Edinburgh, waiting for someone with the right reason to open it. The document was 41 pages long, typed on thin wartime paper and stamped in red ink on its cover sheet with a classification level that meant it would not be read by anyone outside a specific set of offices in Washington for the next 32 years. Its title was Clinical and Unremarkable, Assessment of Chemical Incapacitation Agents for Field Application, OSS Technical Division, 1944. The Office of Strategic Services, the American wartime intelligence agency that preceded the CIA, had been studying chemical incapacitation since 1942. The program was not secret in the sense of being unknown within the intelligence community. It was secret in the sense of being undocumented in any channel that connected to public oversight. The researchers involved were contracted academics, primarily pharmacologists and anesthesiologists, working under non-disclosure arrangements that legally prevented them from publishing their findings through any civilian channel. Chloroform was not the only compound they studied, but it occupied a specific and detailed section of the 1944 report, 11 pages, because it had properties the newer synthetic compounds didn't yet match. It was odorless in dilute concentrations. It was available without restriction. It left no injection mark. And critically, the report noted with the dry precision of technical writing, it produced reliable anterograde amnesia extending well beyond the period of incapacitation, meaning the subject would have no memory not only of being rendered unconscious, but of a substantial window of time afterward. The OSS researchers had not discovered this property. They had read it in the medical literature. Specifically, they had cited 4 sources, all published between 1848 and 1890, that documented extended post-chloroform memory disruption in surgical patients. One of those citations was a brief clinical note published in 1855 by a physician whose larger paper on the subject had, the report noted parenthetically, received insufficient attention in the primary literature. The citation was to Arthur Laycock. His ignored paper, the one that had compiled 123 deaths and been met with professional silence, had been read precisely and thoroughly by the United States intelligence community, not for its warnings, for its data. The 1944 report went on to detail optimal delivery methods for covert administration, concentration levels that would incapacitate within 60 seconds without triggering the cardiac complications associated with higher doses, fabric absorption rates for field application, recovery time estimates by body weight, and recommended protocols for post-incapacitation subject handling. It was, in effect, an operator's manual, based on medical literature that the medical profession itself had declined to act on. The report was classified, filed, forgotten by most of the people who had produced it. In 1976, under a routine Freedom of Information declassification review, prompted by congressional investigations into CIA programs, the document was released into the public record. It arrived without announcement, buried in a release of several thousand pages of OSS administrative documents. Most of the release was covered by journalists interested in other programs, the assassination plots, the psychological warfare operations, the drug experiments that had already become public scandal. The incapacitation report attracted almost no attention. One person who read it was a 28-year-old doctoral researcher at University College London named Eleanor Petrie. Eleanor was completing a thesis on the pharmacology of sedative compounds, specifically the mechanisms by which different classes of sedatives disrupted memory consolidation. It was a narrow field, technically demanding, not particularly fashionable in 1976. She had chosen it because it sat at the intersection of 2 areas she found genuinely compelling: the neuroscience of memory and the history of how medical knowledge moved, or failed to move, from observation to application. Her supervisor had warned her, not unkindly, that the thesis might be difficult to place. She had noted his concern and continued. She found the OSS report through a footnote in a secondary source, a 1975 paper on wartime pharmacology research that mentioned the declassification in passing. She requested the full document through the National Archives and received a photocopy 6 weeks later, the pages slightly crooked. The red classification stamp faded to a dull rust colour. She read it in one sitting in her flat in Bloomsbury, a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her. The Laycock citation stopped her completely. She knew Laycock's paper. It was in her thesis bibliography, cited as an early example of systematic adverse event documentation. She had found it while working through the Victorian anaesthesia literature and had been struck by how thoroughly it had been ignored. Now she was reading a classified government document from 1944 that had found it immediately useful, citing it not for its mortality data, but for its memory disruption observations, the same observations that had been dismissed as insufficiently relevant by every medical institution of the 1850s. She wrote Laycock's name in the margin of the photocopy and drew a line to the citation. Then she sat back and looked at what she'd drawn, a line connecting a suppressed Victorian paper to a wartime incapacitation manual, and understood that her thesis had just become something larger than she had planned. The following week, she wrote to the University of Edinburgh Medical Archive requesting access to any primary source materials related to Victorian-era chloroform research. She expected catalogue listings, perhaps some journal runs. What the archive wrote back was more specific. They had a collection of clinical notebooks donated in 1904 by a Dr. James Petrie, described as personal practice records from 1847 to 1903. The collection had not been consulted since donation. She was welcome to visit. She took the train to Edinburgh on a Tuesday in November 1976. The archive reading room was on the third floor of the medical faculty building. High ceilings, long tables, the particular smell of old paper and institutional heating. The archivist carried the box out from the stacks and set it on the table in front of her. Catalogue number M.S. Gen 1847/P. Acid-free box. 47 notebooks. Eleanor lifted the first one and opened it. The handwriting was neat, slightly right-leaning. The ink faded to a warm brown. The date at the top of the first page was November 5th, 1847, the morning after Simpson's dinner party experiment. She turned the page. She read for 4 hours without stopping. By the third notebook, she had found the irregularities column. By the 7th, she had found the post-procedural memory gap observations. By the 12th, she had found the margin note, longer than the procedure, underlined once. She turned each page with a careful two-handed technique the archive required, setting each notebook down flat before picking up the next, working through them in order while outside the November light failed, and the reading room's single overhead lamp took over. Near the end of the notebook 41, she found the 12-page summary. Petrie's compiled analysis of 27 years of memory gap data, cross-referenced, organised, and never published. She read it twice. The second time she used a pencil to mark specific passages, lightly, as the archive rules required, and copied key figures into her own notebook. Then she found the newspaper clippings. Petrie's collection of Victorian-era reports on chloroform robberies tucked into the back of a notebook 41 alongside the summary. And at the top of the clipping stack, in Petrie's handwriting, the single line he had added: same mechanism, different context. Eleanor sat back from the table. The reading room was empty now except for the archivist at the far desk. Outside the window, Edinburgh's November dark was total, the lights of the medical faculty building throwing pale rectangles onto the courtyard stones below. She looked at what she had assembled across one afternoon. A Victorian surgeon who had spent 50 years tracking chloroform's memory disruption and never published his findings. A suppressed paper by that surgeon's colleague, dismissed by the medical establishment and later cited by wartime intelligence. A classified government document detailing how to use those same properties for covert human incapacitation. And in the newspapers, Petrie had clipped and filed cases from the 1880s and 1890s of people rendered unconscious and robbed of their memory by the same compound. The line ran from 1847 to 1976 without breaking. That was not a historical curiosity. That was a continuous operational fact. She packed her own notebook carefully. She thanked the archivist. She asked whether she could return the following week to continue, and was told the box would be held for her. On the train back to London, she sat with her notes open on the table and stared at the window, where her own reflection looked back at her from the darkness outside. She was thinking about Petrie's phrase, same mechanism, different context, and about the OSS report, and about the gap between those two documents, and everything that should have happened in between them but didn't. She was also thinking about the name on the archive box, Petrie, her own surname spelled the same way. She had not thought to ask the archivist whether there was any biographical information in the collection. She had been too focused on the clinical records. She would ask when she went back. Probably nothing. A common enough name in Scotland. The train moved south through the dark, and Eleanor Petrie's pencil moved across her notebook, connecting things that had been kept carefully, institutionally, systematically apart for a very long time. She did not yet know how long, or how deliberately. Eleanor Petrie returned to Edinburgh the following week, and the week after that, and 7 more times across the winter of 1976 into the spring of 1977. On her 3rd visit, she asked the archivist about biographical records associated with the Petrie collection. The archivist produced a single folded sheet, a brief donor biography submitted by Petrie's son at the time of the 1904 donation. It listed James Petrie's dates, his training under Simpson, his decades of Edinburgh practice. At the bottom, under family, a wife, Catherine, 2 sons, both deceased by 1904, and grandchildren, names not listed. Eleanor's grandfather had been born in Edinburgh. His father had been a physician. She had known this in the way that people know family facts, held loosely, without the weight of specificity. She had never known his grandfather's first name or his specialty. She sat in the reading room for a long time after the archivist took the donor sheet back. Then she opened notebook 14 and kept working. The question of the family connection took weeks to confirm. Birth records, marriage records, a letter in her mother's papers that named her great-great-grandfather as one Dr. J. Petrie of Edinburgh surgeon. The confirmation when it came was not a lightning bolt. It was quieter than that. A closing of something she hadn't known was open. She was reading her own family's history in a box that had been sealed for 73 years, and the man who had written it had spent 50 years trying to tell someone something that no one would listen to. She finished her thesis in 1978. The chloroform chapter ran to 60 pages, longer than any other section, longer than her supervisor had recommended. It drew on Petrie's notebooks, Laycock's paper, the OSS report, and the Victorian criminal case records she had tracked through court archives in London, Liverpool and Brussels. The Brussels file on Margaret Colin she had found by writing directly to the Belgian National Archive with a specific date and location. They had found it within 2 weeks. It had been sitting there since 1891. She read the Brussels file in photocopy at her desk in Bloomsbury. The investigating officer's report, the physician's toxicology observation, referenced and then dismissed. The single word, inconclusive, applied to a finding the physician had made with professional confidence. She noted the date the case was closed, 5 days after the incident. She noted that Margaret Colin's occupation was listed but her age was not, an omission that would have been unusual for a male victim in the same records. Eleanor wrote 6 words in the margin of her copy of the file. The finding was not inconclusive. Then she returned to her thesis. The thesis became a paper. The paper took 3 years to write in publishable form. Shorter, tighter, the 60 pages compressed to 22 without losing what mattered. In 1981, she submitted it to the British Journal of Pharmacology under the title Chloroform and Anterograde Amnesia, a continuous history from clinical observation to criminal application, 1847 to 1976. The journal rejected it in 6 weeks. The rejection letter cited insufficient clinical relevance to current pharmacological practice. She revised and resubmitted to the Journal of Medical History. That rejection took 4 months and used different language. The criminal history sections exceed the scope of a pharmacological analysis, but arrived at the same result. The paper sat on her desk for 8 months. She was by then a junior lecturer at UCL, teaching 2 courses and supervising 3 students. and the paper existed in a professional gap that neither journal had been willing to close, too pharmacological for historians, too historical for pharmacologists. She added a third section connecting the Victorian data to documented 20th century incapacitation cases and resubmitted to Forensic Science International in 1983. They accepted it in 1984. It was published in the spring issue of that year, a journal with a circulation of approximately 4,000, read primarily by forensic pathologists and criminal investigators. It received 11 citations in its first 5 years. 2 of those citations were from Eleanor herself in subsequent papers. She kept working. The citations accumulated slowly. The paper existed, which was more than Laycock's findings had managed for most of their life. She moved on to other research, returned to the chloroform question periodically, added to the evidence base in smaller publications. In 1987, she was promoted to senior lecturer. In 1988, she published a follow-up paper specifically focused on the extended amnesia window, the period beyond procedural unconsciousness that Petrie had first noted in 1853, now supported by neuroscientific research that hadn't existed in Petrie's time. The hippocampal memory consolidation mechanisms that chloroform disrupted had been partially mapped by then. The science finally had the vocabulary for what Petrie had been observing without being able to name. The 1988 paper was submitted first to the Lancet, rejected, then to the British Medical Journal, rejected. Published finally in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in late 1988, same narrow circulation, same slow uptake. Eleanor kept a folder on her desk labelled simply Correspondence, Chloroform. By 1990 it was 3 inches thick. Requests for her papers from researchers in Germany, France and the United States. Queries from police forces, tentative, informal, the kind of contact that happens when an investigator finds a paper that describes something they have been seeing in case files without a framework to understand it. She answered every letter. She sent reprints. She gave 2 conference presentations that were attended by audiences of 30 people in rooms designed for 200. Then 1992 arrived, and everything changed, not gradually. In the London borough of Lambeth, between January 1991 and June 1992, 14 women were brought to medical attention following incidents in which they reported complete memory loss for periods ranging from 3 to 9 hours. All 14 were adults between 19 and 34. All 14 had been in social settings, bars, parties, private gatherings, before the gap in their memory began. All 14 tox screens, where conducted within the relevant window, returned results consistent with chloroform exposure. 14 cases, 18 months, 1 borough. The investigating team at Lambeth CID had not, initially, connected the cases. The victims had come in separately through different routes, some reporting directly to police, some arriving at hospital first, some contacted weeks later when the investigating officers began cross-referencing. The connection was made by a forensic toxicologist named Dr. Sanjay Mehta, who recognized the compound in the 3rd tox result and pulled the previous 2 files immediately. By the 6th case he had called Eleanor Petrie. She was in her office at UCL when the call came. 44 years old, surrounded by the accumulated paper of a career spent working in rooms too small for the scope of what she was tracking. Mehta had read her 1984 paper. He had read the 1988 paper. He told her what he was seeing in the Lambeth cases and asked if she would consult. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The Lambeth cases broke into the press in September 1992, not through a police announcement but through one of the victims, a 23-year-old named Claire Ashworth, who gave an interview to a women's magazine describing her experience in enough detail that 2 other victims recognised their own story in it and contacted the magazine. The article ran 4 pages, included a brief description of Chloroform's properties, and generated more public response than the magazine had received for any piece in its previous 3 years. The calls to Lambeth CID's tip line ran for 2 weeks straight. Claire Ashworth was the same woman whose tox screen the forensic technician had processed in 1992. The same vial he had set down on the steel tray and read twice. Her name had not been in the tox result. He hadn't known who she was. But her case was one of 14, and the 14 had now become a public fact. And the public fact had cracked open a silence that the police reports of the 1880s and the archive box in Edinburgh and the rejected journal submissions had not managed to crack in over a century. Eleanor Petrie was called to testify as an expert witness in the preliminary proceedings connected to the Lambeth investigation. The hearings were held in a courtroom in the Strand, wood-panelled and high-ceilinged, the kind of room where the weight of institutional precedent was physically present in the architecture. She brought James Petrie's notebook, Notebook 7, the one containing the earlier systematic post-procedural memory observations, the one with the margin note, the one Petrie had filled in Edinburgh in 1853, while a coal miner named Thomas Adair was recovering in a room down the hall. The archivist at Edinburgh had prepared a formal letter confirming the notebook's provenance and date. Eleanor had handled the necessary permissions. She carried the notebook in a document sleeve inside her briefcase, and when she set it on the witness table, the leather cover was visible through the transparent sleeve. Dark with age, the corners worn soft, the spine intact. The legal team asked her to establish the historical context for Chloroform's amnesiac properties. She did so methodically. Petrie's observations, Laycock's paper, the pattern of suppression, the OSS document, the Victorian criminal cases, the Brussels file. The court reporter's fingers moved across the keys steadily. The legal team on both sides took notes. Then the prosecution asked her to read aloud from Notebook 7. She opened the sleeve carefully and lifted the notebook with both hands. She turned to the page she had marked with a strip of acid-free paper during her first visit to Edinburgh in November 1976, 16 years earlier, in a reading room where the November dark had come down while she was still working. She read James Petrie's entry from November 1853, his observations about a patient whose memory gap extended 4 hours beyond the procedure, his note about the quality of the absence, not a blur, but a clean edge, the patient describing the period as simply not there. And at the bottom of the entry, in the slightly smaller handwriting of a man committing a tentative thought to paper, the 4 words underlined once, longer than the procedure. The courtroom was quiet. The words had been written in 1853 by a man who hadn't sent his letter. They were being read aloud in 1992 in a proceeding connected to 14 women who had experienced exactly what Petrie had described. The same clean edge, the same absent hours, the same compound. Eleanor closed the notebook and placed it back in its sleeve. The question the court had not yet answered, the question that would take the proceedings another 14 months to partially resolve, was not whether chloroform had been used. That was established. The question was what exactly the legal system was going to do with a substance that had been documented as a tool of assault since 1856, that had been the subject of suppressed police reports since the 1880s, that had been studied as a covert incapacitation weapon by a government agency in 1944, and that remained, as of the day Eleanor Petrie testified, completely unrestricted at the point of industrial production. The notebook sat on the table. The court adjourned. The answer to that question was not in the room yet. The Lambeth proceedings concluded in March 1994. The outcome was partial in the way that legal outcomes often are when the law itself hasn't caught up to the evidence being presented inside it. 2 men were convicted in connection with 4 of the 14 cases. The convictions rested on physical evidence and witness testimony rather than the toxicology. The chloroform findings were admitted but treated by the court as supporting rather than primary evidence, partly because the compound's metabolization window meant that in most cases the tox results were suggestive rather than definitive. The other 10 cases produced no convictions, insufficient evidence. The same phrase that had closed Margaret Collins' file in Brussels in 1891 closed 10 files in London in 1994. Eleanor Petrie's testimony was cited in the written judgment as establishing the historical context for chloroform's amnesiac properties. 3 sentences. The judge noted that the documented history of the compound's criminal application predated the current proceedings by a considerable margin. He did not specify what he thought should follow from that observation. That was not, technically, within the scope of his judgment. What followed, in the years immediately after, was movement, but movement of a specific, limited kind that looked more decisive from a distance than it was up close. In 1995, the United Kingdom added chloroform to its list of substances controlled under the Medicines Act, restricting its retail sale and requiring purchase records for quantities above a specified threshold. France implemented a similar measure in 1996. Germany followed in 1997. Each country acted independently, with slightly different thresholds, different recording requirements, different enforcement mechanisms. There was no coordinated European response. The measures applied to retail and pharmaceutical supply chains. Industrial supply chains were untouched. The chemical manufacturers who produce chloroform as a solvent and synthesis precursor continued operating under existing industrial chemical regulations, which required no documentation of end use. A laboratory, a cleaning company, or a private individual with a registered business account could order chloroform in multi-litre quantities through standard industrial catalogues with no more scrutiny than would apply to the purchase of acetone or ethanol. The retail restriction and the industrial supply existed in separate regulatory frameworks that had been designed without reference to each other, and the gap between them was wide enough to be functionally meaningless as a barrier to access. Law enforcement in the UK raised this gap formally in a 1997 Home Office briefing. The briefing recommended extending documentation requirements to industrial supply. The recommendation was reviewed, determined to require further assessment of economic impact on legitimate industrial users, and referred to a working group. The working group's report was submitted in 1999. Its recommendations were partially implemented in 2003, 8 years after the original briefing, in a form that covered only quantities above 20 litres, a threshold that excluded the volumes most relevant to individual criminal use. The gap persisted, smaller but open. Eleanor Petrie returned to the Edinburgh archive in the spring of 1995. She had a specific purpose. She wanted to ensure that Petrie's notebooks were properly digitised and made accessible to researchers before any further deterioration of the earliest volumes. Notebook 1 was showing signs of acid damage along the outer pages. The archivist confirmed that digitisation was planned but not yet funded. Eleanor wrote to the university's medical faculty and to 2 charitable foundations she had connections with through her UCL work. The funding came through in 1996, enough to digitise all 47 notebooks at archival resolution. A graduate student spent 4 months photographing each page, and by the spring of 1997, the complete Petrie collection was available through the university's digital archive under the same catalogue number it had held since 1904, MS Gen 1847/P. The archive description was updated. The previous entry, Personal Observations, Some of Clinical Interest, was replaced with a description Eleanor had drafted herself, 3 paragraphs, accurately characterising the collection's scope and significance. It named the memory gap observation specifically. It referenced the 12-page summary in Notebook 41. It noted the newspaper clippings and their connection to criminal case patterns. Someone had finally written down what was in the box. The 1984 paper began accumulating citations with the speed that arrives when a field has been waiting for a framework without knowing it. By 1997, it had been cited 41 times. By 2000, over 100. Forensic pharmacology of chemical incapacitation was emerging as a recognized subspecialty, driven partly by the parallel rise of GHB and Rohypnol in assault cases throughout the 1990s, newer compounds that shared chloroform's functional properties, discovered in real time rather than historically. Eleanor's work sat at the foundation of that subspecialty, cited in training materials for sexual assault forensic examiners, referenced in police investigative guides, read by the people who are now systematically doing what Petrie had done alone for 50 years, tracking the extended memory window as an evidentiary and clinical fact. In 1999, a Belgian historian conducting research on 19th century criminal justice wrote to Eleanor about the Brussels archives. He had found Marguerite Collins' file during a review of the period's assault documentation. He had read Eleanor's paper. He wanted to know if she'd seen the file. She had. She wrote back the same day. He published his findings in 2001 in a Belgian legal history journal. A careful, detailed account of how Margaret Collins' case had been closed, how the physician's toxicology finding had been characterized as inconclusive by an officer who had no training in chemical analysis, and how the file had remained uncorrected in the archive for 110 years. The paper was not widely read outside Belgium, but it was read, and it was cited. Margaret Collins' name was in print for the first time since the day the investigating officer had written it in a report designed to close her case. Eleanor retired from UCL in 2003, the same year the revised industrial supply regulations came into effect in the UK. Her office, when she cleared it, contained 4 filing cabinets of correspondence, research notes, and case material related to chloroform, accumulated across 27 years of work that had started in a reading room in Edinburgh in November 1976, where a box that had been sealed for 73 years had been opened and found to contain 50 years of unacknowledged observation. She donated the filing cabinets to the UCL archive. They were catalogued under her name and made available to researchers. Whether they would be used, and when, and to what end, that question she left open. She had learned from James Petrie the cost of leaving things sealed, and from her own career the cost of opening them too early. The timing had never been in her control. The cases kept coming. In 2015, a man in Frankfurt was convicted of using chloroform in the assault of 3 women over 14 months. His supply had been ordered through an industrial chemical company using a small landscaping business as cover. The landscaping business had been registered specifically for this purpose. The documentation threshold he had needed to stay below was the 20-litre limit implemented in Germany following the 1990s reforms, a limit set with legitimate industrial users in mind, not individual criminal operators who had no need for more than a litre at a time. In 2018, a case in Valencia. In 2019, a case in Warsaw. In 2021, a case in Ohio, where chloroform is not scheduled under state law, and where the investigating detective preparing her case file found Eleanor Petrie's 1984 paper through a database search and spent an afternoon reading it at her desk, taking notes in a margin with a pen the same way Petrie had done with Laycock's paper in 1854. The detective in Ohio did not know who Eleanor Petrie was beyond the name on the paper. She did not know about the Edinburgh archive, or the rejected journal submissions, or the courtroom in the Strand where a notebook had been carried in a document sleeve. She knew only that the paper answered the question she had been trying to answer, and that it was 40 years old, and that the compound it described was still unscheduled under the international framework that governed psychotropic substances. She noted this last fact in her case file. 1 line. Then she kept writing. Somewhere in a database server in Edinburgh, James Petrie's notebooks existed in digital form, each page photographed, each line of handwriting accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a reason to look. The margin note in Notebook 7 was a high-resolution image, brown ink on aged paper, slightly faded, 4 words in a hand that had been dead for over a century. Longer than the procedure. The 12-page summary in Notebook 41 had been downloaded by researchers in 14 countries between 1997 and 2021, according to the archive's access logs. Each download represented someone finding it. Whether they had done something with what they found, and what that meant for the people the compound was still being used against. That accounting had no archive, no catalogue number, no box. What the record showed was simpler and harder than any single answer. The distance between knowing something and acting on it was not a scientific problem. It had never been a scientific problem. The science had been there from the beginning. In Petrie's notebooks, in Laycock's paper, in the Metropolitan Police reports filed and sealed, in Eleanor's papers rejected twice, and then read by a detective in Ohio 40 years later. The distance was something else, and it had not closed. Not completely. Not yet. Return to the laboratory. London, 1992. The forensic technician sets the vial down on the steel tray. The result sheet in his hand. Chloroform metabolites in the bloodstream of a 23-year-old woman who remembered having a drink and nothing after. He had read the result twice. Now the viewer can read it too, not as a chemical anomaly, not as a procedural curiosity, but as the terminus point of a line that runs back without interruption to a dining room in Edinburgh in 1847, where a group of men inhaled a sweet-smelling vapour and woke up on the floor with a gap in their memory where time had been. Everything that produced that vial is now visible. James Petrie's notebook, with its underlined notation, and its unsent letter, and its 12 pages of compiled observations that sat in an acid-free box for 73 years. Arthur Laycock's paper, compiled with exhaustive precision, and met with silence so complete it erased a man's career. The Metropolitan Police report recommending retail restrictions in 1887, filed, forgotten, declassified into irrelevance 75 years later. The OSS document that found Laycock's work immediately useful for purposes Laycock could not have imagined, classifying it for 32 years. Marguerite Collins' file closed in 5 days by an officer who described a confirmed toxicology finding as inconclusive and never corrected it. Eleanor Petrie on a train back to London with her pencil moving, connecting what had been kept apart. Every piece of that history was in the vial on the steel tray. The technician didn't know any of it. He knew only the compound and the protocol. He filled out the form, he noted the compound. He forwarded the result to the investigating officer. Procedure followed exactly as designed. Here is what the procedure did not contain. Any mechanism by which the result, Chloroform, 1992 assault case, would trigger a review of why chloroform was still industrially available without restriction. No flag, no escalation pathway, no connection between the tox result and the supply chain that had made it possible. The protocol moved the information forward through the criminal justice system. It had no interface with the regulatory system. Those two systems had been designed separately and had never been formally connected. This was not an accident of bureaucratic design. It was the endpoint of 145 years of precisely that same separation. The pattern in which each institution that encountered chloroform's dangers operated within its own framework, filed its findings in its own archive, and had no structural obligation to speak to the others. The doctors knew, the police knew, the intelligence services knew, the industrial chemists knew. They filed their knowledge in different boxes in different buildings in different countries, and the boxes did not talk to each other, and the compound moved freely between all of them. Claire Ashworth remembered having a drink. That was all. The hours between that drink and waking were gone. Not blurred, not fragmented, but absent in the specific way that Petrie had first described in 1853 and spent the rest of his life trying to find language for. A clean edge. The self simply not present for its own experience. She was not the first. The line of people who had experienced exactly that absence, that particular theft of time and memory, stretched back through the Lambeth cases, through the Victorian newspaper reports Petrie had clipped and filed, through Marguerite Collin in a Brussels alley in 1891, through every surgical patient who had woken disoriented in Edinburgh and tried to account for the hours they couldn't locate. The compound that did it to all of them was chemically identical. Synthesized first in 1831, described in medical literature from 1848, criminally applied from at least 1852, studied as a weapon in 1944, documented in assault cases across 6 decades of the 20th century, partially restricted in 1995, still available industrially with a business account and a delivery address. The technician's results sheet joined Claire Ashworth's case file. The case file joined the Lambeth investigation. The Lambeth investigation led to Eleanor Petrie's testimony, to James Petrie's notebook on a witness table, to 2 convictions out of 14 cases, to partial legislative change that left the industrial supply chain intact, to cases in Frankfurt and Valencia and Warsaw and Ohio that confirmed the gap between restriction and inaccessibility remained operative 20 years after Lambeth. All of it documented, all of it in the record. Now, the final fact. As of the most recent session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the United Nations body responsible for international drug scheduling under the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, chloroform is not listed. Not in Schedule 1, which covers substances with high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. Not in Schedule 2, 3, or 4. The convention that controls specific benzodiazepines, certain barbiturates, and compounds with a fraction of chloroform's documented history of criminal application does not include chloroform. The compound that has been continuously documented as a tool of assault since 1852. That was studied as a covert incapacitation weapon by a government agency in 1944. That appeared in over 1,200 assault tox screens between 1980 and 2000. That was specifically identified in a UN Drug Control Program review in the late 1990s as a compound of concern, not scheduled, not listed, not on the international framework. The review that might change this has been pending since 2019. It remains pending. Somewhere in Edinburgh, in a digital archive accessible from any connected device, the image of a page from Notebook 7 exists at high resolution. Brown ink, aged paper, a hand that stopped moving in 1904. The margin note is legible, the underline is visible. Eleanor Petrie's 1984 paper is in the same database. 37 years old, still being cited, still being found by investigators preparing case files in countries where the laws haven't caught up to what the paper describes. James Petrie wrote his observations down because Simpson had taught him to write everything down. He kept the notebooks because a careful man keeps his records. He donated them because he hoped someone would find them useful. He didn't live to know whether anyone would. He also did not live to know what his great-granddaughter would do with them, how she would carry his notebooks into a courtroom in a document sleeve, how she would read his words aloud into the record of a 1992 proceeding, how the 4 words he had underlined in a moment of tentative private recognition in 1853 would be the last thing a London courtroom heard before adjournment on a Tuesday afternoon 139 years later. Longer than the procedure. He had underlined them once. He had turned the page. The story did not turn with him.